All right, welcome back. So we have a gun and we have the ability to shoot that gun, but we don't have any enemies yet. And that is where our drone pawn comes in. In this lecture, we're going to set up a new blueprint class based on pawn, and we're going to use this pawn class for our drone. And we're going to add a drone mesh so that we can have something to shoot at. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so we have our project here and we are able to shoot this weapon, but we have nothing to shoot at, so we need an enemy. So let's keep our folder structure organized and create a new folder in our blueprints folder. So we're going to right click, create a new folder, and I'm going to call this drone. Now in the drone folder, we're going to make a new blueprint class, and we're going to use the pawn class because the pawn is a simpler class than the character. It doesn't have a capsule component or a character movement component or anything like that. And we don't need that for a drone. Our drone is going to be more simple than that. So we're going to right click, we're going to create a new blueprint class, and we're going to select pawn. And we can call this simply drone pawn. So we now have a new pawn class. Now let's double click that and open our drone pawn. And I'm going to go ahead and close out of these other tabs that I had open. Now here in the drone pawn, we have a basically empty pawn. We have a default scene root. That's the root component, which is a scene component. And we have nothing else. So we need a mesh. Now you've added skeletal meshes before, and that's what we're going to want is a skeletal mesh. We can go into our assets folder and in characters, that's where we have Paragon Lieutenant Bellica. And if I go into that and into characters, heroes, Bellica, meshes, Bellica drone meshes, that's quite a bit, I know, but we have our Bellica drone and we can double click that and we see that this drone is a skeletal mesh. It even has its own really basic skeleton, and as we can see, this mesh looks pretty cool. So we're going to be adding a skeletal mesh. And since you have experience adding skeletal mesh components, you're going to do this. You're going to add a skeletal mesh component, and you can attach it to that default scene root in our drone pawn. So add a skeletal mesh component and go ahead and name it drone mesh. And we're going to set that skeletal mesh on the skeletal mesh component to that drone. So select that drone that we were just checking out. So pause the video and add the mesh to the drone pawn now. Okay, so we got this awesome drone. We're going to add this skeletal mesh to our drone pawn. So with the default scene root selected, I'm going to click add and type skeletal mesh and select skeletal mesh. And check this out. Notice it's already set to the drone, and that's because I had this selected. If I go back into the content browser, notice I have Bellica drone selected. This is a nice convenience that Unreal Engine provides for us. If we have an asset selected and then we go and add something to a blueprint such as a skeletal mesh component, it'll say, well, you have this skeletal mesh selected, so I'm assuming that's the skeletal mesh you want to assign to it, which in this case is true, but that may not always be the case. So just be aware that whenever you have something selected here in the content browser, sometimes Unreal Engine will assume that that's what you want to set things to, so it's something to be aware of. Now, if I didn't have that selected here and I added this skeletal mesh component, well, then I would have to select it from the dropdown as we normally would. And also notice something else. It's automatically named Bellica drone. That's because that's the name of this skeletal mesh. But I don't want to call it Bellica drone. I want to call it drone mesh. So I'm going to rename that to drone mesh. And now my drone has a mesh, which is awesome. Now I can compile and save, and I can go into our level and drag one of these pawns in. I don't want to drag in the skeletal mesh itself. I want to go into my blueprints and into drone and find my drone pawn, and I'm going to drag that into the world. So I'm going to drag in a drone pawn, and notice something right away. You're probably wondering, why is it on the floor? Well, it snaps to the floor by default, and it's halfway through the floor. That's because it's snapping this mesh to the floor based on the location of the origin or pivot point of that mesh. Now, not all meshes will place their origin or pivot point on the bottom of the mesh, that's an artist choice. The artist decided that the center of the mesh should be the geometrical center of that mesh and not the bottom of it. And that's fine. There's a reason why we decided to add the skeletal mesh as a child of the root and not to make that mesh the root itself. If I wanted, I could drag the drone mesh onto the default scene root, and then it would become the root. But I don't want that because I want this mesh to be raised up relative to the root. So I can take my drone mesh and raise it up a little bit. And notice that the root component is still down here, but my mesh is raised up a bit. And that's what I want, because now if I compile and go look in the world, I see that the mesh is floating, and that's exactly what I want. So choosing to make the mesh the root or not depends on whether or not you want an offset like this. So I want to offset, so I'm going to have it offset from the root. So that's perfect. All right, so in summary, we have a drone pawn, and we gave our drone pawn a skeletal mesh, and now it looks great. And now we have an enemy, and we're going to be shooting at this enemy and blowing it up very shortly. So stay tuned. We're going to be doing that in the videos to come. Great job. I'll see you soon.